Warte, warte, noch ein Weilchen. Dann kommt Haarmann auch zu dir. Und mit seinem Hackebeilchen macht Leberwurst aus dir. Welcome to Krautsalat. I am Eric, an American in Germany, here in Hanover. I want to tell you something. Germany's got a bit of a dark history, but Hanover's got something unique. Today, we're going to talk about Fritz Haarmann, der Todmacher, the Butcher of Hanover. Most of my life living in the US, I grew up in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we have a history with two very notable serial killers. First, the Butcher of Plainfield, Ed Gein. If you don't know this guy, this is the guy that inspired like basically all of your horror movies. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, all of this stuff. This guy was sick. And also Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Monster. I'm saying this in a little relation to my interest in this topic. As I've been living here in Hanover, as I've been learning some more things about the history, one night in my favorite club in Nordstadt, above the bar is hanging a big sign, Fleischerei Haarmann. And a friend of mine told me about this. And this is related to a guy named Fritz Haarmann. Hanover's got their own serial killer. This guy, about 100 years ago, he was from Hanover, kind of your typical serial killer, lots of mental problems. Interesting thing, Fritz Haarmann, born in 1879, the end of October. He's almost exactly 100 years older than me. Maybe that's why I've felt a little interest in this. I don't know. This guy, there's so many things wrong with this guy, but I will fast forward through his life up until about the age 40. He lived in a house right about here. He came to a point in his life where he started picking up young boys from the train station and bringing them back to his house where he would later murder them. Here is where the story begins. The Butcher of Hanover. Let's go. I'm going to take you over to his second house. I guess his first 3 murders occurred here, and that was just the beginning of it. So he moved in a house around the corner. Let's go take a look at that spot. Rote Reihe 2. This is the address of Haarmann's second home, and to the best of knowledge, this is where the majority of his murders took place. Now, he didn't do this all alone. He had a young partner by the name of Hans Granz, a young kid about half of his age, helped him attract the attention of the young boys. One detail that's quite important, this was post-World War I, and I learned that Hanover was very poor. Food was quite scarce. He used the luring of meals to get these boys to come home with him. Then this is where it gets really messed up. Starts forcing sex on them. And this is where he gets his nickname, the werewolf or the vampire of Hanover. Allegedly, he enjoyed biting through the Adam's apple of their necks. Now, the interesting thing about that combination of Hanover being poor, food being a bit scarce, Hanover evidently was a major hub for black market sales and activity. So along with that came black market selling of meat. Fritz Haarmann supposedly never owned a Fleischerei. Like, he never owned a butcher shop, although he had the name of being a butcher, but this guy was selling meat on the black market. Now, there's no proof of what that meat was, but neighbors and witnesses at the time would see him often carrying heavy, large bags out of the house. It was not proven, but it is to be assumed that he was selling the meat of his victims, in which he would do whatever with the meat, make sausages, strip the bones, dump the bones in the river, and sell the meat on the black market. That's quite disgusting. A little bit of backstory on this guy. He seems to have a really troubled childhood. I guess he was born here in Hanover. He seemed to have some mental problems. He was a little bit off. For the time, he enjoyed dressing up in his sister's clothes And late 1800s, this was not normal, and the people didn't like this. In his early teens, he went to like a military prep school. I think he got kicked out of that. He got sent to a mental home for a little while. I think the mental home was in Göttingen. He did end up later rejoining the military. Like the post-war time, when he came back to Hanover, he started getting into a bit of the crime circuit, not in the badass gangster kind of way. This dude was like the slime, the scum. Like he was the dude that was conducting criminal activity, but then making buddies with the cops. He was the snitch. He was the dude that the real criminals hated. So like there was just on so many levels, there was so many things wrong with this guy. Because this guy was working as a snitch, he was able to like kind of escape a few situations. Like so many boys, young men were disappearing, and he had a few moments where he was slightly suspected, but he knew the guys and was able to scoot out without any trouble. He ended up having a moment, I guess, one of the boys that he had here, he didn't kill. They were at the main station and got into an argument in front of the people and got the attention of the police. And Haarmann told the police that this kid was traveling with fake documents. So then when the police went and talked to this kid, the kid turned around and said that Fritz had him held in his home for 4 days, raping him. That was the moment when the police really started watching him. And it was not much longer later that they started finding the bones in the river. All of these bones that they started finding, they started investigating, finding boys missing. I guess the scenario at the Hauptbahnhof caused enough attention that the police had it in mind, and they were able to track Haarmann down and bring him in for these murders. And they still had not yet figured out exactly what happened. They ended up raiding his home, finding blood all over the place. The walls, the floor under the floorboards, I learned was just totally soaked with blood. So this guy, he wasn't even good about what he was doing. He was so messy, so sloppy. It's amazing that he was able to get away with it for as long as he did, because he was so messy about it. Hanover's beautiful river Leine, running through basically the center of the city, only a few meters from where this guy lived. He was quite lazy with disposing the bodies. After he removed the meat, to get rid of the bones, he would just come to the river and dump them. I couldn't find out exactly where. I did hear there were spots in Düren. There was also spots like right here. So he'd walk out of his front door with a bag of bones and dump it in the river. Now, that's the part that kind of disappoints me a little bit. This guy put so much into everything else he did and then just took the bones and dumped them in the river. In 1924, Fritz Haarmann and Hans Grans were arrested and charged with the murder of 27 young boys and men. Those 27 have been memorialized here at the Stückener Friedhof. They were only found guilty for 24 of them, and punishment being death. Now, Hans, for some reason, he was given 12 years in prison plus the death, which the information that I found, this didn't really make any sense, and they didn't have a reason for that. Fritz was given death by beheading, and as they were leaving the courthouse, Fritz apparently dropped a letter that he had written, somewhat exonerating Hans of the murders, saying that Hans knew nothing about them and was not involved. Because of the charges and what they just went through in court, Hans still went to prison for the 12 years. This puts him in prison up until 1936, when the Nazis were in power. And one thing that the Nazis did not like were criminals, so he was not released. He ended up bouncing around from the prison into different concentration camps. And he ended up nearby in the infamous Bergen-Belsen. Now, the people that are not from around Hanover know Bergen-Belsen as being the final resting place of Anne Frank. Hans, this little bastard, ends up surviving Bergen-Belsen and still does more prison time. He's not the focus of this story. Fritz Haarmann is. Fritz was killed by beheading, guillotine, the old-fashioned guillotine. So this guy was so messed up, and they didn't know what was wrong with him. They kept his head to study. I couldn't find out if they learned anything, but they literally kept his head in a jar, studied parts of his brain. I think the photos of this head in the jar are just, in my opinion, it's just as strange as the whole story. So I guess it fits. It's a fitting exit to this guy. I was told about this German movie about him. I was told it was really good. I still need to watch it. It came highly recommended to me, so I'll put faith in that and recommend it to you. I will watch this movie. I'm not real big on horror movies. I'm more interested in like these true story things. So knowing what I know growing up in Wisconsin and guys like Ed Gein and Jeffrey Dahmer, and now learning about Fritz Haarmann and how these guys came from opposite sides of the world, but there was still a lot of similarities in their behavior and what they ended up doing. You can't even put it into words. There we have the werewolf of Hanover. Much respect to his victims, much respect to the thousands of people and children that go missing every year. I wanted this to be a little bit more of a serious topic. In the next one, we'll be a little more lighthearted and have some fun. So in the meantime, don't forget Instagram and Facebook. Find Krautsalat, subscribe. I'm gonna go and enjoy the day the best that I can and try to get this monster out of my head. Feierabend.